All right. Aloha mai kako. Mahalo nui iao ko no ke kono ana mai iau. Thank you very much, Uhuluhulu and University, for inviting me. I'm very honored. Yeah, just thank you guys for this. I mean, this is like, I feel awesome being here. One of my good friends, Professor Niklaus Schwartz at UH, just said recently, "Oh, there's one university. There's the best university in the Hawaiian Kingdom right now, and that's Pu'uhuluhulu, because it's an actual Hawaiian place of learning, just like the sign over there says." So yeah. That being said, let me, for those, I guess most in the room actually know me, but so I can cut some of this, I guess, shorter. But just for those that don't know me that well, just little introduction of myself. I just so that you know who I am and why I'm doing this and kind of what's the story behind this face. I was born and raised in Germany. When I was 15, I started to be very interested in the Pacific. It's still like there's various stories of why, and I'm still trying to figure out what exactly that reason was, but let's just cut it short. I was involved in when I was in my teens, in the protest against nuclear testing, the French nuclear testing in Tahiti at that time. There's a little picture of me as a 16-year-old at the protest rally, taking the mic in my hand and speaking about it. It was like the first public speech I did. Anyways, that's kind of the background then. Via Tahiti and my involvement with the movement there, I ended up in Hawaii. I met Kekuni Blaisdell, became part of his hui. I also was a student of Honani K. Trask. She was actually the first person on campus because I went into her office and said, "Hey, I'm Lorenz. I read your book. I want to take your class. Can you help me how to get around on this campus?" So she took me, like really embraced me. Was very kind of super nice to me, and so that's my start at UH back in 2003. That was like more than 15 years ago, and then I also met maybe another person I need to acknowledge, Dr. Keanu Sai, who I at that time he wasn't doctor. Keanu Sai, I met him I went through all kind of Hawaiian independence events, rallies, speeches, whatever, and then I met him, and the whole thing about 19th century Hawaiian Kingdom, legal stuff, political stuff, international relations kind of got me interested. I did my master's in 2008 in Pacific Island Studies at UH. The comparison of independence movement in Hawaii, in French Polynesia, and on Rapa Nui. That was my master's, and then I went on to do a PhD in political science, looking about, again, a kind of pan-Pacific topic, but more from the point of view of Hawaii, kind of the role of the Hawaiian Kingdom in the 19th century and its pan-Pacific diplomatic relations. In kind of from various angles, and my book just came out. That's the kind of short version of the dissertation. It's actually if you're on this island and you're free tomorrow afternoon, there's a book. I wouldn't call it a book launch because I don't even know if they have enough copies. But there's a little book-related event at basically Books store in Hilo tomorrow at 3 p.m. Anyway, so that's kind of where I am and how I got here and what kind of my expertise. I also, the last 2 years after my PhD, I worked in Tonga at Atenisi University. I was teaching there. So pretty much I've been in, there's 27 political entities in the Pacific. I've been to like 5 of them, so not too many, but still been around a little bit. Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Tahiti, Rapa Nui, Aotearoa. I guess if you want to count Australia, I don't know, it's just really Pacific, too many white people, whatever. But definitely Aborigines, sure, honor them too. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk today is a little bit about my research about the importance of the Hawaiian Kingdom in the 19th century as kind of a pan-Pacific force, as a force to gather the various parts of the Pacific and to kind of envision this kind of pan-Pacific unity the way that we're seeing it right now here at Pu'uhuluhulu, with looking at all the flags, all these different Pacific communities, Now there's also a lot of Native American communities which I'm not addressing. That's obviously an important part too, and there were actually quite very interesting and important relationships with Native Americans in the 19th century too. David Chang writes about that. I haven't researched that in detail, but there's definitely that's another book probably to publish. I know the Cherokee Nation did a statement to support Liliuokalani and protest the overthrow. So I mean, there's a lot of that too with Native Americans, but so I'm just focusing today on the Pan-Oceanian part. Anyway, so the way I want to do this, instead of going into like the whole story, just want to share like a few anecdotes with kind of each of these specific countries that Hawaii had relationships with. And so let's start with Aotearoa. Because the one that's actually not in my book, not in my dissertation, because I was looking for relations between the Hawaiian kingdom and the Maori King movement, but I didn't really find any. And during my dissertation and my book, I wasn't able to. I wish I had, but now finally I found something, and that's a kind of an interesting story. So it goes back to who of you has heard of William Hoapili Kawai? Does the name ring a bell with anybody? Some of you, Donovan, because of your land research, you probably know his father, Zorobabela Kawai, who was a member of the original Land Commission, I think of the first team. I think he passed away pretty soon. It wasn't part of it all the time, but definitely in some of the early LCAs of the 40s and 50s, I think his signature is on there. Now he had a son, and his son, he was he had did all kind of different things, but he was the first ordained priest in the Anglican Church, the first native Hawaiian priest in the Anglican Church. And because of that, he was very close to Queen Emma. He was one of the personal confidants of Queen Emma. And so she took him on his trip after when her husband had passed away and her son, and she was Queen Dowager, and she traveled to England and to other parts of Europe in 1865, and he was her main adjutant. I don't know what's the technical term for like a private ex-royalty to travel. I don't know what's the proper protocol term, but he was definitely the guy kind of organizing, helping her organize the stuff, and kind of her travel companion. And on his way back, when they had finished the trip, he went back to Honolulu, but for some reason, because of international steamers and travel, it was getting from England to the Hawaiian Kingdom was pretty hard. So somehow he ended up being rerouted through Auckland, New Zealand, Aotearoa. And while he was there, he started to be interested in like learning more about what's happening with the Maori there. And so he went away from Auckland all the way to Mata Mata, which is in the Ngāti Hawa territory. It's for those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, that's where the movie set for the Hobbit town is, near Mata Mata, but that's also the area where the traditional rohe of Ngāti Hawa, which is one of the main iwi that formed the Kingitanga, the Maori King movement in the 1850s. And now, unfortunately, the Waikato War had just ended, so the British had just defeated, not fully defeated, but they had driven the King movement out of the fertile areas of the Waikato into the mountain areas. And so the people were very devastated about that, losing these fertile lands, and they were all being confiscated, as what they refer to as raupatu. And so people were pretty desperate, and so Kawai met Wiremu Tamihana, who was the highest ranking ariki or like rangatira of the Ngāti Hawa, and he was also one of the leading members of, he was essentially the prime minister of King Tafiao when the Maori Kingdom was in full function, before it was kind of scattered in the war. And so they met each other, and Kawai offered that essentially kind of the Maori nation or the Maori Kingdom, the Maori Kingitanga, he offered them to come to Hawaii, he offered them kind of an exile in Hawaii, because and then Wiremu Tamihana apparently was interested in that, because he was saying, well, now the British took most of our land, and there's so many white people come here, and we don't know how to resist them. Maybe we should go to a place where actually our people are governing the place. And so this was but then a lot of other rangatira from other iwi didn't like the idea, and they wanted, especially like Ngāti Maniapoto, they were still holding on to their territory at the time. So eventually nothing came out of this, but nonetheless there was this kind of this intense feeling of solidarity that Kawai felt for Maori people. And now unfortunately this was just his own idea. It wasn't sanctioned by the government. So when he came back, Kamehameha V was actually super angry at him, and he got dismissed from every kind of official position. Even Queen Emma dumped him too. He was no longer working for her. So I mean, poor guy. He tried to do the best he could for Pan-Oceanian solidarity, and Kamehameha V and his government was totally ungrateful. So that's a kind of unfortunate story. But now having shared that, I'll maybe move on to some more positive ones. Another flag that used to be up there, but I don't know. When I was there last time in July, it was there, the Tongan flag. I don't know what happened to it, but I know there were a lot of Tongan people coming here, a lot of Tongan delegations. So I want to share a little story about that too. So the relations with Tonga, they actually go. Well, obviously all Polynesian peoples are connected, all Oceanian peoples, but let's put it this way, in more recent times, not the very, very ancient navigational times, but like more recent, but still pre-contact, about 1200, 1300s, a Hawaiian navigator, he was very, very, very likely Hawaiian, that the Tongans referred to as Lo'au. Whatever the Hawaiian rendering of this debates of which chief or which ali'i that refers to, but the Tongans referred to him as Lo'au. He came to Tonga, and he brought with him apparently either he himself or like whatever members of his crew. They brought the specifically Hawaiian style of petroglyph art with them. So for that reason, in Ho'omale'ia, in the island of Foa, in the Ha'apai group, there is a coastal coral rock that has petroglyphs that are like 100% Hawaiian style. They're exactly these kind of triangular, like you don't find these kind of designs anywhere else in Polynesia. They're specifically Hawaiian. I mean, there's other petroglyphs. There's the famous Rapa Nui ones. There's petroglyphs, but this specific type with the triangular persons, that's something specifically developed in Hawaii. So that's one early example of a specific connection between Hawaii and Tonga. So there was always kind of this kind of this some kind of special relations between Tongans and Hawaiians that maybe more. I mean, there was definitely more than just everybody just being Polynesian. And now fast forward to the 19th century. When well, let's just skip through like some of the details, but when the Tongan kingdom started to kind of articulate itself in a similar way to the Hawaiian kingdom, trying to get recognition, trying to create a kind of legal system of government, all of this went through this system of modernizing itself as a kind of kingdom. They started to establish international relations with different countries, and different countries started to appoint consuls there. And now, interestingly enough, the first country that established a consulate in Tonga was the Hawaiian Kingdom. And the first Hawaiian consul was a British person by the name of Alexander Blake. His origins are not very clear. He was apparently illiterate originally because his first written documents are signed with an X. And he worked as a printer for the British missionaries in Tonga. But then, at one point in 1855, he received a commission by King Kamehameha the 55, it must be the 4th, to be Hawaiian consul in Tonga. And for that reason, he swore an allegiance to the Hawaiian kingdom. He went back to Tonga. He stayed there and served kind of as an intermediary between Hawaii and diplomatic. Usually the way this worked was routed through Sydney, through the Hawaiian Consulate General, and actually later Chargé d'Affaires in Sydney. But so it was essentially through this guy Alexander Blake that Tupow the first and Kings Kamehameha the 4th and the 5th communicated with each other. And now one interesting thing that makes this very relevant today is that Alexander Blake married a Tongan probably Matapule ranked, which is like a kind of lower ranking chief, like a Kakawali'i ranking woman. And eventually his descendants, like 2 or 3 generations later, married into the royal family. So the current king of Tonga is actually a descendant of Alexander Blake, which is interesting because it actually means that if ever there was, let's say, a revolution in Tonga and the Tongan kingdom was, the king was divested of his whatever, get chased out of the country or something like that, he could come to Hawaii and claim Hawaiian citizenship. Or he could even do it now already. But so there's kind of, so the Tongan king is actually Hawaiian national. That's the story behind this. Another story. Tokelau. There's the flag of Tokelau among those flags there, and I was very surprised actually to find in the Hawaii State Archives communication between King Kalakaua and King of Tokelau at that time, Te Taulu, or well, he said he was King of Tokelau, but I think from reading other sources he was essentially the king of the main island of Whakaofo, not really of the other 4 atolls, but anyway, so Te Taulu of Whakaofo in 1883, he wrote a letter to King Kalakaua. It's in Samoan, not in Tokelauan, because the missionaries there were Samoans. So therefore the written language in the 19th century, written by the literate Tokelauans, was actually Samoan. And so he wrote to King Kalakaua that King Kalakaua should help him to bring his people back. I was wondering what does he mean by that, and I did some research. And so in the 1860s, Tokelau was visited upon by Peruvian slave ships, and they took about 1/3 of the population of Tokelau to Peru. And then, unfortunately, I would say 2/3 of them perished pretty quickly because they were forced to work in guano mines in Peru. That happened to a lot of Pacific islands, like all the more isolated ones. There's a book written, Slavers in Paradise, by horrible title. I hate this kind of paradise thing, but anyway. So the Peruvian slave trade was really bad in the 1860s, like destroyed a lot of small Polynesian communities. And so 20 years later, 1/3 of the population is still missing, and they were trying to find out what it is. So Te Taulu, knowing that Kalakaua is kind of the most powerful Polynesian monarch at that time, so he writes to Kalakaua, so can you help me? Can you help me get my people back? So that to me is very interesting to see that, because it sees that that a very small Polynesian atoll that is essentially completely powerless in this 19th century international system is trying to appeal to Hawaii as being one of the Polynesian brother nations that does have international recognition and it does have access to international diplomatic networks and all of this to help them. I'm still trying to find out what happened, because there's no, some of these materials in the archives, they're kind of very fragmental. So I don't know what happened, what Kalakaua did, whether he sent somebody to investigate, whether he wrote back. I mean, because usually people didn't, much correspondence that was done there, they didn't have Xerox machines, so a lot of stuff that went out, they didn't keep a copy. So if Kalakaua wrote a letter back, that might have ended up there, and I don't know if there's any archives from that time in Tokelau. Possibly not, because cyclones happen all the time, and in some of the smaller tropical islands, stuff doesn't really conserve itself well. I mean, even in Tonga, their archives are very fragmentary because of termites and cyclones and all these kind of things. So anyway, but just this little fragment, I think, of international relations shows you that, the kind of status that Hawaii had at that time, and how other people were looking up to Hawaii as kind of as a power to help them. Another example that I want to mention is Samoa. Samoa is interesting because Samoa has actually a lot of relations in the 19th century. Those who were in Jamaica Osorio's presentations heard about one of the published versions of the Hiaka Ike Palace story. One of the publishers was Bush, John Iloena Bush, who was one of the newspaper editors, and he published one of the various versions of that story. Bush was also involved in uhuluhulu and resisting the overthrowers and the PGs at that time. But what is not so well known about John Bush is that John Bush was actually the Hawaiian ambassador, or actually technically the commissioner, that was the term they used, the Hawaiian commissioner, meaning like the resident diplomat to Samoa in 1886 to 1887. So this was kind of at the height of King Kalakaua's policy of federating Polynesia. Again, the whole idea goes back to the 1850s, but that's when, for example, Alexander Blake was appointed into Tonga. So there has been talk about federating Polynesia under Hawaiian leadership all the way since the 1850s. But it was really King Kalakaua in the 1870s and 80s that was really picking up this idea and really starting to implement it on the ground. Which partly also had to do with Hawaii at that time really having the resources to do that. Because Kalakaua taxed the sugar industry pretty well, so he gathered, so there was a lot of income into the Hawaiian government from that they could use for these kind of for useful purposes like that. And so in 1886, Kalakaua sent John Bush together with another Hawaiian diplomat, Henry Poor, whom I'm actually kind of researching his biography. That's going to be my second book. So these two were sent to Samoa. And their mission was to establish a treaty of confederation between Hawaii and Samoa, which then as the next step, they should go on to Tonga to have the King of Tonga maybe sign a treaty like that as well, and then go on to Tokelau, go on to probably to follow up with this request if Kalakaua hadn't already a few years earlier, to Niue, to the Cook Islands, and to Kiribati as well. So there was kind of really all the islands that at that point had not been claimed by Western powers yet. Of course, with those, Kalakaua couldn't really mess, because I mean, once you get the British Empire against you or the French, that was not something Hawaii could, even if he had sympathized with anti-colonial resistance in those countries, he obviously at that time couldn't really do that. But all those places that were not claimed by Western powers, Kalakaua wanted to ask their leaders to whether they would sign this treaty. And in Samoa, they actually, Malietoa Laupepa of Samoa actually signed the treaty, and it was co-signed by various chiefs who were the kind of representing each district. And that was ratified in Samoa it was signed in February 1887, and then ratified by the Samoan councils, the Taimua and Faipuna, the two levels of councils, high chiefs and lower chiefs, and also in Hawaii by the Hawaiian government, somewhere in March or April or so, 1887. So there is actually a treaty. Now, we're talking about treaties being reactivated and treaties being still in power. I mean, no treaty with the U.S. to annex, but other treaties with various other countries that are still in force, if you go by a reading of international law. But one of those that is actually hasn't been talked too much about in this context is the treaty, the Confederation Treaty with Samoa. So if we go by what is the law of Hawaii, then Hawaii is in a confederation with Samoa. That's something that really took to consider. Like if we talk about kingdom restoration, we talk about reactivating the treaties, Hawaii is in a confederation with Samoa. That's what we're in, because the treaty again wasn't cancelled like none of the other treaties was. The one with Britain, with France, with Switzerland, with whatever. And so that treaty was in existence. Unfortunately, they could not go on to Tonga and to all these other islands, because right in 1887, anybody who know what horrible thing happened in the summer of 1887? Anybody? Bayonet Constitution, exactly. So there was essentially a coup by armed missionary descendants forcing a new constitution on King Kalakaua that rendered him not entirely powerless, but took a lot of his powers away, and especially took voting powers away from Hawaiian commoners, and essentially put power into like the hands of the missionary families, Thurston and those people. And some of the things they immediately did was get rid of any of these Pan-Pacific initiatives, also get rid of pretty much any other global worldly initiatives that the kingdom had. They recalled all the study abroad, all the Hawaiian studies abroad people, like the ones that were studying in Italy, in Britain, in in Japan, in China. All these were recalled because the funding for the program was cut. So these bayonetters, these bayonet people, they really wanted to pretty much destroy any kind of global international connections of the Hawaiian Kingdom, so that it could pretty much just have relations with the U.S. so that eventually they could do what they would do in a decade later. And so with this, the Hawaiian mission was recalled, the Hawaiian mission from Samoa. Actually, a lot of other consulates were closed down too. Like at that time, right before the bayonet coup, the Hawaiian Kingdom had 103 either consulate or legations, meaning diplomatic missions throughout the world. So it was the highest number ever, 103. Altogether there was about 150, but that's because sometimes the consulate opens and then the guy dies and they don't find a successor, and so it's altogether about 150, but concurrently it was 103 in 1887, about in May, or like right before the bayonet coup. And then I think after the bayonet coup that it went quickly down to like 60 or 50, like was significantly, like they'd really tried to cut everything except for where there was commerce that the sugar industry was kind of interested in. And so that kind of, I guess, terminated this idea kind of prematurely. But I guess nonetheless there's the Treaty of Samoa that was not cancelled, so, and even the bayonetters didn't make efforts to cancel the treaty, so they just recalled the mission and just saw it as irrelevant or whatever. I mean, it's kind of interesting that they didn't make formal steps to actually cancel the treaty, which they could have, but they didn't. And so, but then there's one other legacy that's interesting too, is that the Hawaii also sent a naval ship, the Kaimiloa, to kind of also underline, first of all, to the Samoans, to show to Samoa that Hawaii is actually like should be taken serious as a power and that they actually have a warship, but also to show these Western powers that Hawaii is kind of taking this seriously and that they send a warship, even if it's a small warship, but nonetheless. And so that Hawaiian warship, the Kaimiloa, there was, they had some kind of trouble. Discipline wasn't perfect on board that ship at all times. And so there were some sailors who deserted from that ship. And they ended up marrying Samoan families, and their descendants, Samoan women, and their descendants live on Aunuu Island today, which is a small island off the coast of Tutuila in American Samoa. So there you have descendants of these Hawaiian sailors who were part of this Pan-Pacific initiative. Now, one thing that often gets forgotten is the this Pan-Pacific solidarity often gets just limited to Polynesia, but I'm seeing there's a flag of the Federated States of Micronesia and one of Palau. So I want to talk a little bit about Micronesian relations too, because those ones existed too. With Palau, unfortunately, I'm not aware of any. Just because I'm not aware, doesn't mean it didn't exist, because as I said, I always find more and more things come up, and this Hawaiian State Archives doesn't have everything. But I'm just saying I haven't found anything so far with Palau. But for what is now the FSM, there is actually quite a few things. So just a few highlights here. King Kalakaua, King Kamehameha III, Kauikeauli in 1850. I'm not sure, I don't have my computer with me. I think 51 or 53, one of the two, I'm not sure. But early 50s, he sent a letter to King, again, I forgot his name. Well, his title is the Tokoshra, which is like the king or the supreme, like the Mo'i of Kosrae, the island of Kosrae, which is the easternmost state of the FSM today. So, and he essentially tells him that, it's kind of he wants friendly relations, and also to introduce these Hawaiian missionaries that are being sent there too, because there's a lot of Hawaiian missionaries in the eastern islands of Micronesia, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and Kosrae and Pohnpei. The first Christian missionaries on all these islands were actually Hawaiians. So that's kind of an interesting factor to take into account as well. Of course, which doesn't necessarily mean that these missionaries were all people who were really in the spirit of pan-Oceanian kind of Hawaiian kingdom sovereignty. A lot of those were, I would say, heavily indoctrinated by the American ABCFM missionaries here, and then they kind of passed on some of that very problematic mana'o to the people there. Some of them actually, if they stayed long enough, some of them did support the PGs and the Republic back, and then if they stayed all the way till the 1890s. Some of them didn't. Some of them also were loyal to the kingdom. So it's a very complicated story. Kealani Cook, who was here earlier, he has actually examined that in more detail, like all the letters written back by the Hawaiian missionaries in Micronesia. But it's another kind of very interesting aspect of 19th century Pan-Pacific relations kind of coming out of Hawaii that deserve to be examined more. So that was Kosrae, but then in Pohnpei there's another thing because of these connections. Actually both in Kosrae and in Pohnpei, some of the leading chiefly families sent their kids to be schooled in the Hawaiian Kingdom. So for example, Henry Nanpei, who was one of the leading chiefs in Pohnpei, his son was actually sent to Kamehameha schools in the 18. In the first class, like the one right after the school was opened. One of the first students there was a Pohnpei, and the son of Henry Nanpei. One of the princes of the Tokosra family of Kosrae was in Hawaii and lived in Honolulu and was schooled here and educated here, and then came back and became Tokosra of Kosrae in the 1880s. So these are kind of very, very interesting, very deep connections at that time that we don't really talk too much about today, and that need to be. I'm more a Polynesian kind of researcher, so I don't speak any of the Eastern Micronesian languages, so that would be also worth looking into, connecting to families there, looking at kind of sources, family histories, oral histories, maybe written histories, books that people keep, like all these things. I mean, this is all kind of a work kind of in progress that obviously needs a lot of researchers and needs probably the next 50 years or so to really complete. But yeah, just a few highlights like that. I think I've talked enough. I leave it here. I don't want to overwhelm you with too many kind of detailed anecdotes, but I would just open the discussion, and anybody who has questions or comments, or we're a really small group, so maybe we should actually sit down, and this kind of looks so formal here, and then we can just talk story about this a little bit.
Lorenz, did you talk about the plebiscite?
Oh yeah, that's something I didn't, because it's so much stuff. Yeah, I can share that. That's an interesting thing too. That it's a very complicated story. So there were very bad people involved in this story, but also very good people working for the Hawaiian Kingdom. There's a little atoll of Sikayana, which is now part of the Solomon Islands. It's a so-called Polynesian outlier. So these are Polynesian-speaking people that are on an atoll that's very close to Melanesia. And it's still today populated by Polynesian-speaking people. Maybe about 600, 700 or so. Very small, very isolated, no airport. It's really hard to get there. So in the 1850s, I think in 1851, a British adventurer / slave trader / evil kind of whatever anti-native person. I don't like him by just reading his bio. Anyway, he went with his ship to Sikayana, and he somehow got the aliki of that island to sign a document to supposedly cede his atoll to this guy. Benjamin Boyd was his name. So Benjamin Boyd took this paper back to Sydney and claimed, well, I am now the owner of this atoll, and he was trying to sell it to somebody else. No, actually, sorry, that's wrong. I got it mixed up. No, Ben Boyd was later in the Solomons on Guadalcanal. He was killed. Rightfully so. I'm proud of Guadalcanalians for doing that. I talked to Tarcesus Kapitalaka the other day, and I told him how proud I am of his people for killing this guy. Anyway, but then his lieutenant supposedly inherited the claim. He was in a way less evil because he hadn't previously been a slave trader, but nonetheless he was part of this strange crew. He, somebody by the name of John Webster, he went to Sydney, and then he didn't know what to do with this, and then he sold it to his friend, and that friend of his happened to be the Hawaiian consul in Sydney. Or actually the Hawaiian Consul General, and what was his full title? Consul General and Commissioner to the Chiefs and Tribes of Oceania. So this guy, by the name of Charles St Julian, the Hawaiian diplomatic representative in Sydney, he then communicates to Kauai. I think it was still Kauai, but then the succession passed, and later with Kamehameha IV. So he communicates back and forth with Hawaii and say, well, I supposedly own this island because some adventurers bought it and they sold it to me. And so, but because I'm the Hawaiian consul, I want to make these things right. And this is like, I mean, I guess the Hawaiian kingdom should take this clue, because now I'm the Hawaiian consul. The Hawaiian kingdom should take this claim over and actually, like, I guess, formally annex this island. And then they discussed it in Privy Council, and they said, yeah, sure, well, it's actually, why not? It's a good idea, like, because these kind of pan-Oceanian ideas were already circulating among certain circles in Honolulu, that Hawaii has kind of, as being the first recognized nation in Oceania, has kind of the kuleana to be kind of a kind of pan-Pacific Oceanian kind of do this policy, take care of other people in Oceania as well. And so then eventually it went into Privy Council, and they were saying, well, okay, we annex this island. But then Kamehameha IV stood up and said, sure, we annex this island. I'm all for extending the Hawaiian kingdom south of the equator. But don't forget, there's people on this island. And what we need to do is we need to have a plebiscite and have the people of this island, of this atoll, actually vote whether they want to become part of the Hawaiian kingdom or not. Because I'm not doing this kind of weird, like somebody signed something and these people probably didn't know what they're signing and all these kind of things. So it's kind of a very interesting way how this kind of something that comes out of a very problematic kind of Western settler adventurous kind of colonialism is being converted into actually what probably is the first instance of kind of the right of self-determination for indigenous people. I mean, as we would call it today, being articulated. And that's Kamehameha IV who is doing that. Now again, unfortunately, it never actually came to that. It was just actually these people of Sikayana never heard of any of this ever. I mean, fortunately, nobody. I mean, they never even saw any other howling guy till maybe in the 1890s when the British came and actually then took it over as part of the Solomon Islands colony. So nothing really happened to these people. Nothing came out of this whole thing that affected the people of Sikayana, because Hawaii at that time just didn't have the money, because they were like the Hawaiian warship that was supposed to go there and conduct the plebiscite and do all kind of stuff that never even happened. They didn't have the money at that time, because this was before the sugar industry. Hawaii was really poor comparatively, didn't have the money to send a ship all the way there and all that. So it never actually happened, but the fact that it was discussed in Privy Council, and there was this incredibly progressive idea that people should vote on whether they should become part of the Hawaiian kingdom, which is the time when powers right and left were just grabbing places, and they were killing the people if they wouldn't consent, you know. And to have during that time this kind of progressive idea, I think is really amazing, you know, to think about this kind of what progressive spirits were around in the Hawaiian kingdom at the time. So thank you for mentioning that. Any other? Hey Andre, good to see you. Any other comments, questions, debates? Yes?
Since you teach a lot across the Pacific and you do a lot of traveling, researching, and I'm just wondering, what is the perception in the Pacific of Hawaii's standing today?
Mm-hmm.
So like how we, through your research and the research of others,
Mm-hmm.
are very aware that Hawaii was diplomatically engaged all around the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
Do other Pacific Islanders understand that there is a diplomatic relationship between us and them, given how politically Americanized Hawaii is perceived
sure.
in a lot of parts of the world?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious.
Oh, thank you. That's, I mean, a wonderful question. I think that's, I would say, simple answer would be yes and no, and I'm elaborating on it more. I would say overall, I think the awareness of the details is probably not. I mean, not. I don't think everybody knows exactly that Hawaii is occupied. That there's a I mean, people probably are aware that there's more, especially now with Mauna Kea. I think it's really the awareness is bigger. How much there's an awareness that Hawaii is still independent, is occupied. I think that depends. How well people do research, how well they're connected. I mean, there's also people who a lot of people obviously make connections, Hawaiians traveling there back and forth and so on. So I would say it's hard to generalize, but there are some kind of, I think, also interesting anecdotes that shows that there's amazingly much of this known. I think Tonga, because Tonga is probably the one where the awareness is probably biggest. Just because one reason maybe because Tonga was never formally colonized. It was just a British protectorate, so the kind of, I mean, in other ways, Tonga was very heavily colonized, I guess, ideologically, because the population is very heavily Christian and very conservative to some extent. I mean, there's a lot of problems there too with kind of westernization ideologically, but in terms of actual political control by a Western power, that was very superficial there. So kind of the education system, the way it was set up in the late 19th century, wasn't really interrupted and messed up by a kind of Western ideologies, the same way as it was in, obviously here in Hawaii, but also in a lot of colonized places in the Pacific. So this kind of thing about the Hawaiian consul in Sydney, St Julian, kind of transmitting the Hawaiian constitution as a model for Tonga to write their constitution, is actually written in the Tongan school book. So there's some of that awareness kind of is there, that probably most Tongans know that their constitution is based on the Hawaiian constitution. So that awareness is still kind of around to some extent. It's also interesting that in the Tongan phone book, if you look at international country codes, you want to look up Honolulu and you look under United States, and then there's Houston and there's whatever comes after H, but you don't find Honolulu there. But then you look under the country names, you look Haiti and then Hawaii plus 1808, like as a country. You know what I mean? So that's kind of, and then the Tongan phone, and then because I've checked every time, like from 2005 when I was first in Tonga all the way to 2019, they reprinted like that, and so it was not a mistake or anything. So there's a very, very conscious kind of like Hawaii is something different. It's not US. Also, the Tongan consul here in Hawaii is I would say probably the most aware and the most progressive minded of the consular corps, and who is obviously has to be careful because being accredited formally by the state of Hawaii, she can't openly like be strongly outspoken about things, but I've seen her, anyway, don't want to go too far, but so yeah, I mean, I think in Tonga there's a certain kind of awareness of that. Also all the information I know about Alexander Blake is mainly based on the research done by another descendant of the Blake family who published a book in Tonga about him and his connection. So I mean, there's a lot of that stuff is happening in Tonga. So Tonga has I think there's quite a lot of awareness of that. In Samoa too, there's some. The Samoan Prime Minister in 2011, when he founded the so-called the Polynesian Leaders Group, it was a kind of a sub-regional organization that once in a year the leaders of all the Polynesian countries, including the territories like French Polynesia, American Samoa, meet each other. When they founded it in 2011, the Prime Minister Tuilaepa actually said specifically interestingly enough, the founding conference was on the 28th of November. I don't know if they're aware of what that means in Hawaii, but it was that day. And he said to the Samoan newspaper, Savali, the daily, is it daily or weekly? I forgot. But in an interview, he said, well, this is not a new idea. It goes back to the Hawaiian kingdom and those relations between, and he mentioned all the people who were involved, Kamehameha, Kalakaua and Tupou the first of Malietoa of Samoa, and he mentioned all the people who were part of this. So there is kind of awareness of this. And he said that before Kealani did his research, before I did my research. This is not something that comes out of research out of UH. This is something that probably was transmitted in the Malietoa family or in some other. I mean, I didn't research how this went, but I mean, there's another example of that awareness being there. So, of course, I could also tell you other anecdotes of people who are just, oh, Hawaii, that's U.S., or oh, that's Hawaii, that's where Polynesian people lost their sovereignty and it's now America, it's all American now. So of course you have those kind of people too. It just depends on who you talk to and but I think the Mauna Kea issue is really the one that is really strongly correcting these misconceptions now, because it's so much all over social media. In Tonga, there's one of the local artist groups. They made a big mural, Kukia i Mauna, Malu'ia Mauna Kea in Tongan. So, yeah, there's I think that the last year has been of tremendous influence in kind of raising this awareness in the rest of Oceania about Hawaii.
Thank you.
Oh, of course.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Might be a little bit similar, but a little bit different. It's more non-political, but I guess it is political at its core. I haven't traveled to Tonga or Samoa, but I've been to Tahiti and Aotearoa, and when I think about kind of on your question that we're so Americanized here, very true in certain ways, but in certain other ways, it's not. And one of the things that I've seen is here in Hawaii, we've had for decades a big sort of revitalization of religious and ceremonial practices. And at least in my travels to Aotearoa and Tahiti, I've seen that here we will pray to and acknowledge directly to our primary akua. Right? We'll worship Kane, Kanaloa, we'll worship Lono, and there's even Ku practitioners. But when I went to Aotearoa, I saw that they're culturally strong and strong in language and strong in a lot of their community social dynamic traditions and ceremony. But I listened carefully. They don't pray to the primary gods. They mostly acknowledge their ancestors, right? Their tribal ancestors. So I started asking, like, do you guys, are there practitioners in Aotearoa that actually pray to Tane, Rongo, Tangaroa,
Tawhiri Matea.
Right.
Yeah.
And every time I ask that question to Maoris, they look a little like they got to think about it. And from what I can tell, it's very minimal. In fact, I couldn't find actually anyone directly that actually worships directly to their primary akua. And so I went to Tahiti twice. The first time I wanted to learn about the older gods, particularly Ta'aroa, Kanaloa. And what I found out was that there was one book in Tahiti, a scholarly book that was written about their akua. But the guy who wrote it, and I forget his name, he had to come to Hawaii to do research. Because primarily they have Te Wita Henry. Very extensive, very comprehensive, but it's one single source. And I went to Tahiti. The second time I went, and I found one traditional practitioner in Maroto, a guy named Libor.
Oh, okay.
You met Libor?
No.
Maroto? Anyways.
I'm very close to another one of those, but not that's Mona Ura Walker. I don't know if you met him as well.
Very narrow amount of people. And I imagine, so my nephew is Samoan, my brother's son, and he was raised in Wailoa, in American Samoa. And I asked him, he's like, there's nobody that he knows of that are traditional practitioners and worship traditional akua. And I imagine the same for Tonga. But I wanted to know, what's your thoughts on that? What have you seen? And particularly maybe Tonga, Samoa, Fiji.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Excellent question. I think, first of all, I answered a specific question right away, but just one little reflection on that, on Hawaii's role in that. I think it's true, I think, that despite Hawaii being supposedly very Americanized, but I'm always thinking that in Hawaii, let's put it this way, I think there's if you dig deep enough in Hawaii, there's a lot of traditional cultural practices that were preserved, and I think overall it's probably, I would agree with you, it's maybe probably more than anywhere else in the Pacific. I think one of the reasons is because as much as Hawaii was supposedly Christianized very early on and heavily Christianized, and by the same people who then overthrew the monarchy and all that, the whole story we all know. But the fact that even like with certain elites of the country, it never really took hold. I mean, don't forget, Kawai never even formally joined the church. I mean, he did all kind of stuff to promote Christian whatever stuff, but he never became a Christian. He never got baptized. Kamehameha V revived traditional rituals in the palace. Kalakaua even more so. I mean, these people were, so essentially we had a ruling elite in the kingdom that was only nominally Christian, but was actually really practiced, was actually, if you really take all the layers away, were cultural practitioners and were continuing most of the traditional practices. So I think that's an important thing, whereas I think in most of the southern Polynesian islands, you had at least the elite being, I think, more thoroughly really converted, and actually, like Tonga, like Tupou the first saying, I'm giving my country to Jesus Christ. Kawai never said that explicitly. I mean, he did some very pro-Christian policies, but he never said that explicitly. You know what I mean? So Kalakaua would have turned in the grave before he would. I mean, he would never. I mean, Kalakaua is the one who changed the national anthem from a Christian hymn to an anthem that says "Our Heavenly Father Kamehameha." So I mean, that tells everything, about that in the 19th century. You know what I mean? So I think that Hawaii really has something that other islands have to a larger degree lost, I would say.
And that's been sort of my experience and my perspective or analysis, that a lot of the times we're seen as, very Americanized and tourist, and cultured around tourism. But I also think that sometimes we forget to look at that component.
Oh, yeah.
That we have strong religious practices directly worshiping our primary akua. And I just haven't seen that strongly in other places.
Yeah, sure. No, and let me just go on with this. So I think another reason also is because Hawaii had had this very strong I mean, it's ironic, but it's because the early high technology that was in Hawaii, which included printing presses and high literacy, so a lot of things was written down and printed just like a generation after the missionaries came. So there's such a huge body of traditional knowledge that was printed during the kingdom, and it wasn't really the same amount in the other islands. And part of it was that maybe the people were more thoroughly converted, but also maybe because the technical capacities weren't there at the same level. There weren't like 10 printing presses in Tonga at the time. There was one controlled by the Wesleyan mission, you know what I mean? Whereas here you had people in the 1860s already had a completely independent press here that had nothing to do with either the government or the missionaries. So I mean, these kind of things weren't just there in some of the smaller islands. I think that's one aspect. And of course, you're right. I mean, in terms of what is there today, I think I wouldn't say there is nothing left, because you have, I think if you dig deep enough, you find cultural practitioners even in these heavily Christianized places like Samoa and Tonga. But I think they're much more socially marginalized, because it's very hard to be non-Christian in public in some of these societies. I think you have some of these traditional practitioners more in the diaspora in Aotearoa. Like you have Tongans in Aotearoa who are praying to the Akua. Not too many, but I know one, what's his name? Visesio Siasao, he's my friend. He is explicitly non-Christian. He prays to the, practices worshipping the old gods. He's an artist. He makes kind of sculptures, like all kind of stuff. But he was mainly raised in Aotearoa, and he's now moved back to Tonga. But I mean, he's a kind of quote unquote marginal figure socially, because it's a very heavily Christianized kind of society. And in Tahiti the same thing. I mean, Moana Ura, my good friend, who is also very clear, he's in Pire, cultural practitioner. He's like non-Christian, very clearly like does But I mean, for the longest time, he has been kind of socially marginalized too. Now it's kind of starts to change. People are interested in that. But I mean, it is definitely the kind of Christianity is so much more mainstreamed there that it's really hard for these people to articulate themselves. I think it's
a difficult conversation because of the power of the ideology.
oh yeah.
And like one of the my experience in college, and I don't think I'm an academic. I don't call myself that. But in academia, what I've witnessed is particularly in political science. There's a lot of talk of decolonial everything, right? And decolonizing the diet, decolonizing relationships. I think I saw this presentation, Colonial SelfLove, or whatever that means. But my critique is that I never see a whole bunch coming out of political science. And I went to a couple critical ethnic studies conferences, which I think is high level and nice or whatever. But I rarely, if ever, see talk or discourse or research or analysis around decolonizing religion. And my feeling is that if we're talking about decolonization, and we agree that it's ideology that creates the hegemony that keeps us, under the yoke of colonization, then I think that if we really want to decolonize in terms of the power of ideology, we should start at least take a look at decolonizing religion at the forefront. Yeah, we can't decolonize our diet and decolonize our relationships if we're still under the yoke of Christian hegemony. But I feel like there's very little scholarship or discourse around decolonizing religion. We just don't want to decolonize everything else. But religion is the most powerful ideology that keeps us conforming to, whatever Western American, whatever it may be, power values. And so that's kind of been my path around, with my MA on carving, is revitalizing the relationship with our akua through carving, through ki'i, and my intention is not only to revitalize carving, but to subvert the power of Christianity on our people. We talk about sovereignty, independence, but we're going to be a sovereign nation that's still Christian. Are we really sovereign? In our minds and in our thinking, in our values. Anyways.
No, that's actually, you exactly talk like my friend CSO from Tonga. He's exactly that. You say we're not colonized? We're the freaking most colonized place in the Pacific because we're all Christian. That's what he's saying.
I remember I had a little discussion with Ron Williams, who was making this argument that the churches at the time of the overthrow were really important to sovereignty because the churches were, actually before the overthrow. But what he was saying was the churches were really important to preserving Hawaiian language. And they were. Yeah. I agree. But you can't stop there. So I said, they have been preserving Hawaiian language, but what were they saying? Whose ideology were they transmitting? And how was that ideology impacting the thinking of the Hawaiians at that time? So Hawaiian language is important, but what you say in Hawaiian language is important also. Anyways.
I have a question. So you focus mostly on diplomatic relationships during 19th century. And so 19th century there was King Kalakaua's punishment policy. And then 20th century you see NFIP, different diplomatic movement. Then you see Mauna Kea. So you have from the top to the bottom for Kalakaua, then you have from grassroots to the top for the NFIP. And it feels like Mauna Kea is this kind of hybridized thing because to a certain extent you see all these flags and people coming with this whole people, which could be also a diplomatic kind of offering. So what's your analysis of Mauna Kea? And could you see it as a middle kind of thing where you have this kind of grassroots anchoring and still have kind of diplomatic expressions or offerings too? Because something interesting with NFIP is that it's like Walter Linney from Vanuatu 1983 told Kumealoha Gomez that, you guys, you're still independent, you should just check it out. And she didn't really believe it. And then later on, with the occupation stuff, it just happened. So what's your analysis of Mauna Kea? How do you see this kind of processes, just mingling between this kind of diplomatic alphabetic thing from the top to the bottom.
Okay, I answer once the national anthem is over. Okay. Short version. I think it's an excellent question, and I think I would agree with your analysis to a large degree. I mean, I think definitely like Kalakaua's stuff was kind of bottom to top, which doesn't mean that there wasn't also grassroots level. It's just the question. The problem is that we don't have much written materials to document that. But if you look at how many Polynesians or any Micronesia, how many Pacific Islanders were hired as sailors on these ships and jumped ship everywhere, and like how many pan-Pacific relations happened on the grassroots level of people who were mostly illiterate and mostly didn't leave kind of written documents. So I think it's also kind of a source bias that tells us that 19th century relations were only top down and not bottom up. But of course, what we know about it and what's well researchable today is definitely a diplomatic kind of state level, kind of kingdom level, whatever, government, ali'i, chief level kind of relations. I agree. NFIP, I agree. It's very much from the grassroots, and also I think at least for Hawaii, in a way, in a more at that time relatively marginalized. I mean, because if you look at the people in NFIP, Soli, Kenkuni, Skippy, I mean, these were people that were, even within the so-called sovereignty movement at the time, rather marginal figures, as important as they were ideologically. But if you think about in the 1980s, 90% of the Hawaiian activists were in Kalakaua and were kind of pro-Fed Reg, right? And this was a kind of a small group that was kind of really, really radical and strong and with NFIP. And of course, they left a very, very important legacy that all this is essentially built on today. And yeah, whereas now I think with Mauna Kea, it's kind of it works at many levels. It works at all these levels, because I mean you have pretty, I would say, pretty mainstream people all over the Pacific who would not necessarily be known as radical activists who support Mauna Kea. I mean, I've seen people who I would never have thought that they would do anything like that from other Pacific islands, put like just like on their Facebook profile, put like Kukia Mauna and like those kind of. I mean, so it's going way beyond what we would normally consider the kind of radical activists. Will it? I hate talking during the national anthem. So I think that Mauna Kea, I mean, is it going to the highest? I mean, to the level of governments? I don't know. Has any Pacific Island government leader yet come to Mauna Kea, to Puhuluhulu? I don't know. I'm wondering.
I don't know if there's been a big one, but it's been my understanding, as Soli Nihil was a mentor to me,
Yeah.
And so was Kekuni. It's my understanding, if I remember correctly, that it was Hawaii, that it used to be nuclear-free Pacific, and they added independent later. And I think it was largely with input from Soli and Kekuni, who added that in there. So Ku'umealoha may not have known about that part, but definitely other parts of our community, other activists like Soli and Kekuni in particular, and Skippy.
Yeah.
I think, if I remember, and Terry was supposed to be here today, so she would have been a good resource. But I think that, I remember talking to Terry about this, that the addition of independent in the acronym, NFIP, might have come from Hawaii.
Yeah.
Because they were talking about, you cannot, and I know this for a fact, at the time as they were forming, they were talking about demilitarizing. But you cannot demilitarize if you don't have control of your government. So independence was a big part of the question that, before, if we're going to demilitarize, we got to be fighting for independence at that time for NFIP.
It was at the conference in Hawaii that they did the independent element, but I think it's also thanks to Kahine Wanikila Kaka too that they also push for that thing, not only just Soli guys.
But I I knew Moani very well, and I don't know that she was a full-on independence person, Moani. She was more Hawaiian rights. Because when we formed Hui Pool and we were fighting FedRec in not that long ago,
2004,
15 years
5
ago,
or something. Yeah, yeah.
we, I remember Moani. We had to be careful about being too pro-independence, because not all of our people were pro-independence. And we first formed Hui Pool. Mililani Chas was with us, and Moani was. Not everybody had a clear analysis on independence, so our focus became just fighting a Kakabil FedRec, mainly because we didn't have free prior informed consent. We didn't have any consent. But I don't know. Maybe she was.
But she was also trained with the Black Powers. I mean, she attended on the West Coast.
Yeah,
so she already has this kind of like outside of the
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
system
Yeah,
thinking.
Kokua, Hawaii, yeah. And they went to the 1771. I think they went to the Black Panther conference.
But can I chime in on your question? Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, like, I think about that a lot too when I watch what goes on over there. And I think, I'm sorry, I'm gonna keep talking. This is part of her poem. But it's kind of like this idea of recognition. Like we're self-recognizing. And so these kupuna, how I see it, and thinking about that, like that's who people are coming here to recognize. You know, or like when they travel here somewhere in the Pacific, Aotearoa or whatever, they make a point to go up there to recognize. So it does feel like so much more diplomatic, where the paradigm before this was sort of like how we talk about cultural exchanges. You know, we'll go meet, contact, or whatever. This is something very different, and so I don't think we can totally put our finger on what it is. It's emerging still, but it's awesome. I love it.
What I think is different though is NFIP had a common cause, yeah, which was around the nuclear testing. And Hawaii, we had nukes here in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor subdays. So there was this common cause that kind of bound everyone together in solidarity to form NFIP. Mauna Kea is so Hawaii specific that I don't know that it could be a catalyst for something bigger. It could be.
Well, don't forget that Epeli Hau'ofa had his vision when looking at the Mauna. Well, in 1993, when Epeli Hau'ofa wrote Our Sea of Islands, and he had that epiphany, because previously he was essentially writing like kind of like a colonial. I mean, in a way, he was kind of, our islands are too small, and we really need this kind of Western development. That's the only way to go, and whatever. And then he had this epiphany where he totally like switched and like went into this Our Sea of Islands, and he was driving along probably he was right here in Puhuluhulu when he was looking at the Mauna. Then he got this vision like Oceania is great. Oceania is not some marginalized whatever. So I think that's something that to think about if you think about how Mauna Kea can relate to the entire Oceania. To think about this connection, because almost every scholar maybe not every common person, but anybody who studies anything in the Pacific knows Epeli Hau'ofa's work, and it's on almost every bookstore you can find it. So maybe that's a way of.
I feel like kind of like you're also raising questions about the state, right? What is the role of the state?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we're looking at a nation, a nation that's based on that's state-centered versus a nation that's land-centered.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like this is raising like what a model for land-centered nationhood looks like, not state-centered nation. So I don't know. That was kind of what I was thinking when I was listening to what you're saying. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I do have a question. I don't know if I have time, but like November's weird. I guess we're gonna talk about Tahiti still, but November's weird because that's also the time when Tahiti, the French wars, right, and the loss of independence. At the same time, we had Lakopo for Hawaii and the Hawaiian Kingdom's regulation. So for me, like it's a weird experience of like just waking up this morning and seeing the French flag flying right in front of the Hale. And I get it. It's a messy situation. You take one song and whatever. But I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I don't know. How do we navigate those kinds of situations where you have like Kawikioli and Omade in conversation, and she's asking for help, but Kawikioli's like now's not the right time, and we're going through some of the similar things and all that, and so in terms of solidarity, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to fly the French flag and at the same time, like they did recognize this part of my identity and my people, but at the same time they stole the other part.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, the same thing.
I
And
don't
we,
have any answers, but like,
well, the same thing can be said about the British. I mean, the British were, I guess, friendly in a way to Hawaii. There was Queen Victoria was the godmother of the prince and like all these kind of things, and the Queen loved Queen Liliuokalani loved Queen Victoria and all this. But at the same time, the British Empire was screwing over the Maori and was raupatuing all their land. I mean, so you know, there you got the messiness, the same messiness with the British flag too.
I mean, I guess at the end of it all, I'm like, Christianity fucked us all up. So, I guess it was even less there. But yeah, just kind of thinking about those things.
Yeah.
Mahalo, Lorenz. Yeah, mahalo.
Oh, yeah. I'll let you be here.